Hey guys, it's Mark with another Ham Radio psychology video. Wow, these are so fun. I love it because I realized I was watching the other video that I made, the last video, and I didn't have any gear that I was showing, any radios or anything like that. And so I was like, oh, it's like a ham radio video with zero ham radio. But there's something to that. And I want to talk about that today in this video. Last video, Paul, VE3EBY, thanks for your comment, Paul, said, hey, I wonder if you would consider a video on those who stubbornly resist change. You know the types, from rejection to absolute panic when presented with a new concept, procedure, or activity. He said, this is not just related to amateur radio, obviously, but I do see it most evident in the hobby. So that's very interesting. In fact, there is really something to that, Paul. And I wanted to talk about the psychological tension within ham radio a little bit today. There are... as someone who's kind of my job as a coach is to help people read themselves. And so I do a lot of people reading in my training with different psychological models. And there's one I want to use today, psychological models called Temperament. And this was made popular back in the late 1900s by David Keirsey in his book, Please Understand Me, and the follow-on, Please Understand Me Too. Temperament has existed as a model of psychology for over 2,000 years, and it is a fascinating way to divide humanity into roughly 4 groups of psychologies. And the psychology is both a template that explains them and their motivations, and it also gives us a way to look at groups of people and organizations, and not just individuals. In fact, each individual has their own individual traits that might set them apart a bit from their temperament, no matter what their temperament is. But really what the temperament or the kind of personality type models do is they help us to get a lot of leverage by looking at a group so we can understand more and have more tools to use as we talk about that group and learn about it and observe it. So the 2 most common temperaments within ham radio, these are really interesting to me. The first one is your SJ. These are what Linda Behrens calls the stabilizers. And the stabilizers are generally, they prefer to look toward the past and preserve past tradition, past kind of the way things were done in the past. And their way of looking at the past is convergent. In other words, they tend to think about the one way of doing things that applies to this current situation as things were done in the past. A better way to say that would be maybe in ham radio operation in the past, maybe there were like hundreds of different ways of doing things, but maybe they only remember one of them that they loved and enjoyed and made sense to them and that worked really well. And so that's the one they want to emphasize and bring forward into the future, is that past convergent idea of the one thing that they would really prefer be done in this or that situation. So as an example, they will tend to kind of organize meetings in the same way over and over, where they've got their own way of doing it that works, and why would you ever want to try another way? This is reflected in, if we go into Jungian psychology, everybody's got this opposite mode. So we kind of flip, Jung's theory was that we flip between opposites to kind of recover, to regain our energy from using part of our psychology too much. So what we would do in this case is flip from a convergent look toward history and the past, usually our own past. We'd flip from that toward its opposite, which is a divergent view of the future. And what that results in is the SJ, or the stabilizer temperament, who tends to be very stuck in the past and not super flexible with their psychology, maybe they were raised in a family of stabilizers, so they've had even more reinforcement. They are going to feel very shaky when they bounce into that divergent future thinking mode, and all of a sudden when you start to bring up new ideas, they feel like, whoa, okay, everybody hold on to something, we need to stabilize this, because anything could happen. That's the divergent nature. All they can think of is possibilities and wow, anything's possible. They don't have a convergent view of the future so much. They can have that if they develop it as an individual. It's available to everybody, so it's not like they're locked out of that. But a lot of what you see in ham radio is people who are very, very comfortable with the stabilizer aspects of ham radio because they themselves are stabilizers. So you can look back into the past of ham radio or the history of ham radio and see how like any stabilizing organization, it eventually evolves to have almost its own law enforcement arms. It's really fascinating to me to see this happen over and over, where stabilizer organizations, if taken a little bit too far in some ways, or if really reinforced, they'll tend to kind of develop their own feedback loop system where people who aren't observing the standards or the stabilized norms or the bylaws or the laws, those people, there's kind of a telling on people system built into the organization. So that's not to say that that's completely counterproductive, because we do, as the stabilizers will remind us, we do kind of serve, we kind of fit a guest role in this hobby. So the other personality type or temperament that's so prevalent in this hobby is the SP, or the improviser temperament. Now, improvisers, as the name would suggest, are not really into stabilization so much as they are very comfortable just kind of seeing how things go. Live and let live, right? And you can hear these guys when they feel a little bit too much pressure from the stabilizers, they'll take it to the low HF frequencies, and you'll hear them down there, right? If you've heard them before, you know what I'm talking about. And they'll just go wild and crazy, and it's like chaos. And chaos to an improviser is kind of an opportunity. It's kind of fun, and it's kind of what you live for, is, hey, this concept of partying, right? And so there is this side of ham radio that's really, really kind of people that want to have fun. And unfortunately, if they get too crowded out by the stabilizer psychology, they can sort of revolt, right? Become this sort of, they feel like they're a prison population all of a sudden, right? So we want this, we want these guys, the SP, people that have an SP in their 4-letter personality type, we want them to feel a little bit like they've got a place where they can be kind of chaotic and improvise. And they're the guys that walk up to the meeting and they've got like a Bofeng that they've modified the battery pack, right? And they've got this like USB charger adapter, and they've got like a hanger wire sticking out where the antenna should be, right? And to a stabilizer, that's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Have you not read the recent FCC publications on what Chinese radios or whatever it might be? And stabilizers might even overreact. And when you see this happen, what they'll do is they'll even start to invent rules that don't really exist, which can be really dangerous for the hobby. So there is this kind of balance of personality types. The cool thing is, though, that you see a lot of improvisers like the ISTP personality type, really cool personality type. These guys in ham radio will just show up to things. You'll invite them, say, hey, we need your help, and they might forget about it. But even if you call them day of, that's what they're good at. They're good at improvising. Hey, they'll just drive over and make it work somehow, right? So it's really a cool balance that we see, but there is some tension there. Now, a third personality type, to get to Paul's comment, is this third temperament, the theorist temperament. There's a fourth temperament, which is our catalysts, and this is a very, just generally speaking, is a bit of an effeminate temperament. So we don't really have many of those in ham radio, and it shows in some of our blind spots and how we communicate with each other. We don't really harmonize well in ham radio as well as other organizations might. We're very direct and blunt, which is not really something that catalyst temperaments would kind of countenance for very long. So but this third personality type you'll see is that, and this is personally my own temperament, is the theorist temperament. And theorists, kind of opposite to these stabilizer SJ personality types, are really comfortable thinking in the future. That's one of their kind of attributes. And Paul, your comment reflects that, because rather than feeling panic when presented with a new concept, procedure, or activity, a theorist kind of goes, yeah, what about that? How would that potentially change the hobby? So theorists need intellectual freedom, not as much scheduling and kind of, places you can go and things you can talk about freedom like the improvisers do. But theorists, the NT, the personality types have an NT in their 4-letter personality type code. They need that intellectual freedom to kind of think and to conceptualize. If you've ever heard of that term, conceptual or concept design or conceptualization, that's a really big theorist term to use. And the cool thing about theorists is they have access to both of Carl Jung's 2 identified modes of thinking are very, very strong within the theorist group, as well as the 2 identified modes of intuition, which is both divergent intuition, thinking about the future and all of its possibilities, and convergent intuition, which is where you go, I see where ham radio needs to go. I do. I see as a hobby where it needs to go. And even though this is just one possibility, there's a very, very high probability that if we go in this direction, it will reward new people in the hobby. It will be very, it'll turn out really well for everybody involved. And we can take into account all these other psychologies. So me making this video here, I'm not making this video because I just thought randomly, oh, it'd be fun to make a video on psychology and ham radio. I'm making this video as a sort of way to contribute to this kind of conversation we're having about how ham radio is and what we like and don't like about it. One of the things that I really like about ham radio is that we have access to all this technology, and some of it you can see is more theoretical than others. If you looked at the Hepburn maps and you studied those for your ham radio exams, that's a great example of a new theory that's come out pretty recently in ham radio terms to talk about propagation of VHF signals. So if you look at that, mostly that's kind of mental activity that formed this theory, and we have these maps and we're studying these like, this is fascinating. Look, I could open up and this day the weather could change, and all of a sudden this tropospheric ducting thing happens, and wow, I could talk for 300 miles on my handheld or whatever it might be. That is theory emerging into practice, right? And the more we have of that, more we have room for that in ham radio, and the more we have, importantly, theorists within ham radio who realize they can do that and that it can help, the more happy as an organization ham radio is going to be. We want to make sure that we have the interplay of these different styles of thinking within ham radio so that one doesn't take over, because what happens when you get one dominant psychology is you essentially become a cult of that particular psychology, and that doesn't make anybody happy. Even the people themselves who are of that temperament that's dominant, you'll see they'll start to split off and kind of go, man, there's a bunch of you guys who are really hardcore here, and I'm not, and I'm out. So that's one way to ruin an organization, a team, a hobby, is to like go whole hog on one psychology, personality type, or temperament, and not flex to accommodate other points of view. So the theorists can figure out ways. Theorists can actually come up with a problem like, oh, okay, the stabilizers are kind of having their way and being really rules oriented. Here's a way we can let them keep doing that, but also grow the futuristic conceptualizing part of the hobby. So if you, Paul, for example, if you're a theorist type, or if you appreciate that way of thinking, you might keep your eyes peeled for people that have those conversations, see if you can link up with them and see what you can make happen within the hobby. Personally, there are some really cool exercises for theorists within ham radio. For example, just flip through a dictionary, look at random words, and see which words seem to suggest changes within ham radio that could be beneficial. Now that, if you can understand that and the value of it, that's an intuition exercise, very intuitive. And people who are stabilizers, for example, or improvisers might kind of think, man, that's like way ahead in the clouds, like, whoa. Maybe some of them can appreciate it, as they often can, but it's very much a theorist temperament, kind of a strength, is to be able to get in there and hear those kind of flighty, kind of head in the clouds ideas, and actually turn those into concrete results for our hobby and for ham radio in a way that improves it for everyone. So just a few words on those kind of how those temperaments can kind of work together, and also how they kind of butt heads. It's really important to keep in mind these differences while also understanding that we're all here to support each other and make this hobby better for everyone. All right, I hope that's been interesting and helpful and useful, and I look forward to making more videos, guys. Take care.